Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lucien, an attorney at PPM Attorneys in Johannesburg, South Africa. As many of you know, South Africa successfully hosted a spectrum auction earlier this year. Now, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa is considering how best to facilitate the rollout of 5G in South Africa. It hosted a 5G conference earlier this week, where discussions on how this process is going to occur took place. But perhaps before we start talking about policy developments in 5G, I should give you a quick background on what laws apply to this sector if you're getting involved in it for the first time. Some of the laws you might need to look at include the Constitution, because that talks about freedom of expression, the Electronic Communications Act, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa Act, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, the Cybercrimes Act, the Protection of Personal Information Act, and this strange one, but I'll explain why, the Local Government Municipal Systems Act. Now that last one doesn't really relate to communications, but why it is relevant is that it has recently published draft bylaws that deal with the rollout of electronic communications infrastructure and allows for the rapid rollout of that infrastructure. So, perhaps let's focus on some of the more important laws that are specific to 5G. As I mentioned, there's the Constitution, there's the International Telecommunications Union, which is not a law, but we are a signatory as South Africa to this treaty. There's also the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa Act and the Electronic Communications Act, as I mentioned earlier. But what is important is the proposed next generation radio frequency spectrum policy. So as I say, proposed, it's still in draft format. Now, if we look at that policy, what it attempts to do is to address some of the issues that arose in the past, like clashes between the regulator and the Minister of Communications, as I will call her. But remember, as I mentioned earlier, the Constitution gives everyone in South Africa the right to the freedom of receiving or imparting information or ideas. And that is why pushing out 5G is critical to the country. The quicker we get 5G and other infrastructure out to rural areas and difficult to reach areas, the more people are able to access information and spread their thinking as well. We mentioned the International Telecommunications Union. That's also important because whatever South Africa agrees to at the ITU, it would need to implement in South Africa. So policy developments and discussions and decisions at the ITU regarding 5G are typically then implemented in South Africa through various pieces of legislation, regulation, and policies. The most important piece of legislation we would need to think of or look at as far as 5G is concerned is the Electronic Communications Act. And why is that? That's because it has essentially two components, if I could call it that. The first deals with policy, and it stipulates that the person responsible for policy developments in South Africa is the Minister of Communications. It then says that as far as administration and monitoring of spectrum is concerned, for example, licensing and making sure that everyone complies with their licenses, ICASA takes care of that. So those are the two main areas or main roles that the Electronic Communications Act provides for. Now, having dealt with the Electronic Communications Act, another draft policy has been published recently called the Next Generation Radio Frequency Spectrum Policy. It makes various recommendations, and these recommendations are essentially designed to promote or improve the way that spectrum is used in South Africa. And in that, it also provides for 5G related matters. So what's important about the Electronic Communications Act is that it provides for two main roles. The first role is the Minister of Communications' role, and that entails developing policy in South Africa. The second role is ICASA, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa's role. Its role is to administer the Act, it looks after licenses, deals with the issuing of licenses, and ensures that licensees comply with their licenses. Now, as far as 5G is concerned, ICASA, during the course of 2021, released a study or a report called The State of 5G in South Africa. That report, in preparation for rolling out spectrum related to 5G, deals with and makes a number of recommendations. And those recommendations are: South Africa needs to make provision for a clear framework for infrastructure deployment. What that means is that we need to have clear municipal bylaws and related laws that allow for a consistent and quick approach to rolling out infrastructure across the country. The next recommendation is regarding 5G standards and type approval. We currently don't have type approval for 5G equipment in South Africa. We also need to look at 5G use cases and identify the most important ones and promote them in the country. What's also highlighted is that a minimum amount of spectrum called minimum contiguous assignment is necessary to ensure the useful and efficient use of spectrum. What's also dealt with is spectrum trading, which makes the exchange of spectrum possible. It also recommends the importance, or deals with the importance, of cybersecurity as far as 5G infrastructure is concerned, and also looks at how we would address the issue of misinformation or fake news. So how are those recommendations going to be dealt with? Well, the Minister of Communications earlier this year released a proposed policy, and that addresses many of the issues that ICASA raised in its 5G report. Now, as far as cybersecurity is concerned, so now that ICASA has made these recommendations in its 5G report, how are they going to be implemented and dealt with? Well, the first draft policy that assists with achieving this is called the Next Generation Radio Frequency Spectrum Policy, which was put out for public comment earlier this year. And it addresses a number of the issues that ICASA raises in its report. It doesn't deal with two critical ones, though: the issue of misinformation and the issue of cybersecurity. Those are dealt with in other documents. The Cybercrimes Act is a piece of legislation that we can rely on to address misinformation and fake news. I think with a few tweaks, it could certainly do the job. Then as far as critical infrastructure is concerned and cybersecurity in that regard, we have a piece of legislation called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. I think that with a few regulations passed under that, it would be possible to stipulate minimum standards that could be required for critical infrastructure and electronic communications infrastructure. The one final aspect that needs to be addressed is the delays that have been experienced in rolling out critical infrastructure or electronic communications infrastructure. And the way that this is being dealt with is that piece of legislation that seems so strange right at the beginning. I mentioned the Systems Act. Well, there is a draft bylaw that has been published for public comment, and it puts proposals forward regarding how municipalities can take a common approach with regard to the rollout of electronic communications infrastructure across South Africa's various municipalities. And ideally, if each of these draft policies and bylaws come to fruition, and if the necessary changes are made to laws like the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, then I believe 5G will be able to roll out a lot more quickly and efficiently across South Africa. So watch this space for updates and follow us on social media, LinkedIn and Twitter, for more regular updates on developments in the ICT space. Thank you.